recording this computer. All right, so welcome WEBPT4 After Hours. Today we're going to be building a server with a database and some relational data, and we're going to be using session auth. So we're going to be building it from the ground up, starting with an empty code. And with that, I'm going to be sharing my screen. Let's see here. Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, there we go. All right, so I'm gonna be bringing out my editor or my terminal, and we're gonna be starting from the ground up. We do have some people in the chat with us, so if you feel like asking anything or if anything's confusing or anything, feel free to just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. That way we don't have to completely stop to read the chat thing, but if you want to just put it there because you don't want to unmute yourself, feel free to do so. Okay, so a few things that we first need to do. We need to add in our packages that we're going to be using. So we're going to be using bcrypt, connect sessions, cores, .env, so a bunch of stuff. So it's best to get them out the way first. So first we're going to do let's just do a yarn init just to start our project, and I'm just going to speed through everything. Some of the stuff in here, because of the way I build my applications for better scaling, are going to change. Mainly this entry point over here will eventually change. So we're going to bring in yarn add. We're going to bring in bcrypt.js. We're going to need that for our password hashing, and then session, connect session knex, cores, .env. Of course, we're going to need express. We're going to need express session, and make sure that you're putting session without the s at the end. Faker, we're going to need that basically to get fake data for our seeds. Helmet gives us security stuff for when we're sending things through the header. Morgan, and finally SQLite 3. We're also going to be using NodeMon, but you have to install that as a dev dependency since you don't really need it during development. And that also goes for like if you're installing a testing library, you don't need that during development. So anything that you don't need in order to actually run your application will always go into a dev dependency. All right, so we're going to do a yarn add NodeMon, and then -d. And then we're going to need some files in our main root directory. So first thing that we're going to need, of course, is going to be an index.js. Could Morgan go into dev dependencies? Morgan can go into dev dependencies. It's really just a logger that helps you see a bunch of things. So I guess you could put that in there as well, since you don't really need it to run your application. So that's a good question. We're going to need a server.js. This file will not be staying in the, actually none of these files will be staying in the root directory. We'll be moving those out of there. So we'll try to keep our root directory as clean as possible. And then for right now, that's it as far as the files. We're going to create a directory for our server. All right, so that basically gave us what we need over here. Let me just move this out of the way. So now we have our server, our index.js, and our server.js. So what we're gonna do is actually move that in here. And the reason I'm moving that in there is because we want to keep this area as clean as possible. Eventually, you're gonna have your client folder as well for your React app or whatever other front end you decide to use. So you wanna try to keep that as clean as possible. And the way that you can set it up so that your application knows where your server is and you can still run it from the root is you come in here into where it says main, and this basically helps to tell everything what your entry point is going to be. So for us, our entry point now is going to be inside of the server file, and it's going to be looking for index.js. We're also going to be adding some scripts as well. So this will help us run our application. And so we're going to be putting our start script over here. And in case you don't know, Heroku will basically not run without this start script. So it needs to be able to find it in order to run it unless you do a proc file. So you might have some huge headaches if you don't put that into your package.json. Next thing we're going to do is just add a script for NodeMon so that we can run it while we're doing development. And with NodeMon, what it's going to do is it's going to look up to this main file over here and basically run NodeMon and then main and then see where the actual index file is. In case you're wondering why we didn't have to specify it for NodeMon. Okay, so we did all of that. So what I want to do now is we're going to continue with our scaling. So when I build a server, I like to shove all of the server stuff directly into the server file. And I like to split it up into 3 folders. So one of them is going to be our API, and the API is going to be responsible for holding everything that has to do with interacting with the database and then sending it to the client. So it's going to have our routes, our helpers, all of that stuff. And you can also put your middleware in there, but I'm going to put it into a separate file. So we're going to have API, we're going to have config. This is going to handle our middleware. And then we're going to have a separate folder for our data, which is going to be our migrations and seeds and our actual database file. All right, so now we have those files in there. Let's just move this out of the way again. All right, so there we go. So another thing that we also need to do is initialize Connects, because we're going to need that. And Connects does have to remain at the root directory for it to work. So we're going to do a Connects init. And then that'll set us up with our initial Connects file. All right, so for the purpose of this, we won't really be needing a lot of these files or a lot of these lines over here. For deployment, you do need them, just not for now. For production, this will basically handle everything and send it to Postgres. Staging is kind of similar to production, but it's more so for like a testing environment. But we really only need development for this. So let's just clean that up. One thing that you do want to do, however, is make sure that you spend a little bit of time in this directory and just basically set it up. So we're going to have our use null as default, if I could spell, and then set that to true. And then we're going to set up a location for our migrations, because eventually we want it to go inside of this data folder that's going to be over here. So we put in our directory and then set that to server, and then data, then migrations. And then our table name is going to be just DB migrations. It's just a default name. Same thing for our seed. For our seeds, we don't really need to add a table name because it doesn't care about that. We just need to have our directory. And again, if you don't put this in here, it's just going to default to wherever the Connects file is, which in this case is going to be the root directory. All right, so we're done with that. Okay, so now we want to start filling in our index.js. Actually, this should be down here. There we go. All right, so now I just moved the Connects file into our root directory. All right, so we're gonna want to start filling out some of our index.js first. And so eventually our server is going to be coming in from server.js. And then if you remember this line over here where we bring in the port. So once you deploy your website to Heroku, it already has this env over here. It already has an env called port. And so try not to get those mixed up. I've seen some people that would put this port in capital letters, and that can really throw it off once you actually get into the deployment process. So, and then we're going to initialize our actual server. So we're passing in port right there, and then rec res, and then we're going to console log, and let's just say message. We don't even need that actually. We could just do a regular console log. And then say server is running on, and then pass in the port. And the reason why you always want to pass in the port is in case you do forget and then you have to test your stuff and go into the localhost, last thing you want to do, because I have seen some people who have passed in different port numbers than what it actually is. So down here, they hard coded like 3,000, but they were really on 5,000, and that threw a lot of their project off. So just be wary of that. All right, for our server, over here, we're going to bring in express. So we have express, and then we're going to initialize our express server. A lot of times in the doc, you'll see them actually write this as API instead of, or as app, I should say, instead of express. So we could bring in our middleware here and just say something like server.use and then put the stuff in there, but I don't like having to do that because I don't like my files being completely filled up with a bunch of stuff. And so instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create a file called middleware or middleware config, just to try to keep this file as clean as possible as well. And that's going to be coming from that config file. And we'll build that out in a second, but initially I'll show you how we use that once we build it out. So this will be where the middleware will go. And then this will be where the routes will go. And then we'll do our sanity test here. So we'll effectively split up our code into just 3 different sections and keep this area nice and clean. So we'll have our server.get routes, and it's going to be rec res, and then res.status 200.json, and then we'll just say hello world. All right, so last thing that we need to do before we can run this is make sure that we export the server. So in case you're confused how just exporting the server works, initially we brought in Express, we initialized a server under this variable, and then we take it through the ringer and pass all these things around to it. So basically all of these things get added to the server as it's going down the line until it finally gets over here, and now we're pretty much passing all of this stuff that has gotten passed to server. So all of this kind of gets added to it. Hopefully that makes sense. So before we run it, I do want to also build out our middleware as well. That way we can use the JSON parser. So we're going to create a middleware file, just call it middleware.js, and we're going to bring in Morgan, and then cores. So pretty much all the good stuff that you already aware of. Helmet, and then I'm also going to bring in require .env because we're going to use that later. All right, so that's pretty much it. Now what I want to do is we're going to do a module.exports, and we're going to treat this as a function, and we're going to pass in the server into this function. And then we're just basically going to say that we're going to attach the server to the actual calls for the middleware. So Morgan, and then we can go with dev. Let's see, server.use, and then add in cores. But essentially what we're doing is we're separating our code and keeping everything as clean and modular as possible. That way, when you're in a team environment and you're building with other developers, actually we're not adding sessions yet, we'll add that later. You're building with other developers, then you can touch a lot of code without getting into anything like together and conflicting. So if I were to want to add middleware, I have a location where I can do that without worrying whether or not somebody else is touching the same code. All right, so what we can do with that is now we can bring in this middleware that we built over here and just drop it right in here, and we can just add server. So now because we have server initialized up here, we're passing it into this middleware. So when I initialize it up here as a variable or as a parameter, I was able to use it down here, but at this point, it doesn't really know what it is yet until we bring it down into the server file. And then we initialize it up here, and now we're passing it in here, so now it knows what the server is. And then another one that we have to use is server.use and then express.json. This is the only one I haven't figured out how to actually attach to this. So if you can figure it out, by all means, I'll share it with everybody. But that's pretty much our middleware for now. Eventually, we're going to go back in and add sessions, and we're going to add a restricted middleware function to help us make sure that nobody can get into those routes. For right now, however, I want to run the server and keep my fingers crossed, hoping that everything works. All right, we're going to cd into our main root directory, and just to make sure that we are there. Yep, there we are. So we're going to do a yarn server. And then here's hoping that everything works. All right, cool. So everything works. So if I were to close this, move this out of the way. If I were to close this directory here, you'll notice we don't have a index.js or a server file. Again, that's because we told it over here in the main script in the package.json that's in this folder. So that's how it knows where it is. All right, so the next thing that we want to do is begin building our database. We can't start getting our routes and stuff yet because the data actually doesn't exist, and that can be a pretty huge problem. So the first thing I want to do is set up my config for the database. So we're going to create a file and just call it dbconfig. And eventually what you'll be using this for is to be able to differentiate what environment you're in. For us, we're only going to be using development, and so we're just going to be writing that, but you can also include like your test environment so that it knows that it should be targeting test files, or you can use it for production in case you want to use different files for that as well. Because it can be a bit confusing, I think, whenever you're doing your DB stuff and then you go into the next file. But essentially all this file down here is doing, all dbconfig is pointing everything to this next file and then choosing whether you're in development, staging, or production, which we don't have in here. We only have development. So that's all it's really doing. And then from there, it'll go into those migrations and seeds and everything and just run it off of that. So we're going to keep it simple and just say let env equal development. And then we're going to module.exports our knex, and then pass in our knex config, which is basically our knex file down here. And then we're going to pass in our env, which is just going to be development. So if you're treating it like if you're treating an, let's say, an object, then you're basically saying that we have a file called knex config, well, In this case, it's representing knex file. And then inside of that, there's a property called development. So that's all it's really doing. Okay, so we have that done. Now we can get to the fun stuff and start getting into migrations. And so the first thing that we're going to need in our migrations is going to be a student, and then we're going to create another table called post. So let's just bring this up over here. We can stop this server for now. And so with our migrations, we can just do knex migrate, and then just say make students. All right. So we have our student. In order to double check that it went into the right location, it created this migration file for us and then created the student. So all of that is properly nested. And then we're going to need another one called knex migrate make posts. And then I like to do the seeds at the same time. So we can say knex seed run 001 and then student. And then you can also mix it up and just do them both like this by adding the double ampersand and just say run 002 posts. Oh, can't do that, never mind. Don't do what I just did, it broke. I figured I'd live a little dangerously and try it out. Okay, so it was more so something with my actual, here we go. So cool, we get to actually debug something real quick. So that is possibly something in my knex file from the looks of it. So let's see, directory. Let's see, did I spell something wrong here? All right, so we have migrations, directory, and then .server, data, table name. Did I misspell directory or something? DB3, which part are you talking about? Are you talking about over here? No, you actually don't want to use DB, the DB extension. It's preferable to use the SQLite 3 because the DB, for some odd reason, that one, like it's very similar to SQLite 3, but comes with some very weird, odd bugs. Just doesn't work the same for some weird reason. Okay, so I think I know what my issue is. So I need to change the location of this. So server, and then change that to data and then put it in there. So that's one issue that I have. And then, all right, so let's see if that fixed my issue. If not, then we're just gonna close this down and act like nobody's ever saw this. All right. Okay, no such file directory, scan directory, blah, 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 seeds. Okay. So it can't find this file for some reason, so let's see. All right, let me just test this out a few times. Huh. Let's see. So that's never happened. What's up? Did somebody just say something?
Yeah, do you have to manually add the seeds directory or no? It'll automatically implement itself.
You shouldn't have to, but just for the sake of it, let's go ahead and give it a shot. I'm pretty sure you shouldn't have to do so. Nope, yep, the only thing I got was no seeds, no seed file exists. Oh, I know what I did wrong. Okay, so what I basically did wrong is the fact that, first off, let me delete this. I was using the wrong knex command. So debugging avoided, I was using run instead of make. So yeah, everybody makes stupid mistakes, man. All right, so let's just switch that back over here, and hopefully this time it doesn't break. There we go. All right. So what that ampersand command does, basically it runs the first code, and then after that's completed, it'll run the second code. You can't really make it to run together like at the same time, though I'm pretty sure there's probably a bash command for that somewhere. I just am not that interested in finding it. But we have our seed and we have our migrations done over here. So I'm not going to do anything fancy with the migrations. I'm just going to just write them out here. Next, schema dot create table. And then we're going to create a table called students. And then just table, which by naming conventions, you can make this student or something like that if you want, if that makes it easier to remember what you're looking at. But I'm just going to go with table just to speed up the process. It's less typing. All right, so username, and then we're going to give this a username max characters of 128, and then not nullable, if I can spell, there we go, not nullable dot unique, and then table dot string, and that's going to take in our password. All right, and then that's also going to be not nullable. Okay, so don't forget to do the down function. So I actually forgot to do that a few days ago, and then I did it in another migration, just not in in like the one I was working on. And so because of that, my other migration rolled back while the one that I wanted to fix didn't roll back, and so that created an issue, and I ended up having to delete the database and do a bunch of weird stuff just to get it to work properly. So make sure that you're always adding this one as well. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to be doing is the post, and the post is going to have a reference to the student. That way we know who it belongs to. So this one is going to be very similar. Schema, create table, and then this one's going to be called post. And then table dot increments, table dot text, and then this one's going to be called post dot not nullable, because otherwise why would you even post? All right, so this is the fun part. We get to add the integer, and then that's going to be student underscore ID. And then it's going to take a references to the ID in table students, which, by the way, if you want to explore anything fun, you can do this entire thing just based off of regular knex commands. So if you're using the raw command, which I'll show you once we start getting into routes, you don't really have to actually use these knex commands. You can use just straight SQL, which is pretty great because I find SQL to sometimes be easier than knex commands. For me, the way I generally like to do it is I'll type it into my, I guess you guys call it SQLite Studio. They generally have an area where you can just type in SQL and then get what you need. So that's a good area to treat as a playground before you even go into your code. And so that's generally what I do. Okay, so now we have that going on. And then we also have to create our seeds for our students. So we don't really need the ID because SQLite is going to be handling that for us, or Knex will, I should say. And then we're just going to switch these over to username, and then change the table name to students, and then there. All right, so random names of people who I've never met, and then there you go. So I have no idea how to use a Mac. Okay. All right, and then one more because it can get pretty boring just looking at me do seeds the entire time. All right, so nothing fancy, just regular old seeds. And then for our post, if you remember earlier, we installed Faker, so we can actually bring that in now. And Faker, in case you're wondering, helps you create a bunch of fake data, and it's not limited to what we're going to be using it now. So I definitely recommend you look into it at some point. But Faker lets you create pretty much just about any fake data that you need. So usernames, some text. It'll even let you bring in like images and stuff in case you need like placeholder images. So really good package to use. All right, so, okay, so I'm really only need one for now, and then I'm just gonna copy it over. All right, so faker.lorem.words, and let's just give it like 20 words. That doesn't really matter. Student ID, for right now, it's just gonna be that. And then we're just gonna copy it over a bunch of times. Okay, so as we do that, we're also going to change some student IDs just to make sure that we have some variations here. All right, there we go. Okay, so there goes our seeds, and then we should be able to create our database now. So we can just do our knex migrate latest. And if I didn't break anything, then it should work. Oh, I broke something. Wait, I probably misspelled something. There we go. So something broke. Let's see. Next.schema.create table. Okay, so I didn't spell table properly. So this is why we always have to make sure we're reading the error messages. So there it is. There we go. Usually when you're dealing with these error messages, like only like 1 or 2 lines is actually what you need to know. The rest of it is just telling you that somewhere in the dependency it crashed. So you just have to kind of skim like through it and find out what file it's in. In this case, it told us a good example right here, and I knew exactly where to look. But if we were to go through this whole entire thing, eventually one line should be able to do it. Yeah, sure. We could do a rollback. Let's see. So let's see. Next, migrate latest. Oh, still broken. So let's find out where it's broken now. Let's see. Table.integer. So I apparently can't spell integer. At least I think I can't. All right. So integer. There you go. I think that's how you spell it. And then just to make sure. Okay. All right. So an example where you would do a rollback. So let's say I did this migration, and let's say that later on through my project, I realized that, okay, my student who's not completed, my student only has a username. Next thing you know, our project requires that we add, like, let's say a flag, like if they did something, or Now we want to also include like a picture for the student, or we need basically any data that you want to add in there. You could go through the struggles of doing an alter table and things like that, which is great for once your project is in production and you don't want to lose data. But if you're still in development, then just doing a simple rollback would be pretty much good enough. If you don't care about the data, because once you do a rollback, this down function will kick in and it'll pretty much just drop the table, just as the function over here or the method states. It'll drop the table, so you won't really get that data back until you migrate again and then run your seeds again. So the only thing that will be saved is whatever is placed into the seeds. Hopefully that helps clear it up, Lawrence. Okay, cool. All right, so we ran our table, and now we want to next seed and then run. So we want to run our seeds as well. And then here's hoping I didn't break anything. Okay, so there's our seeds. So the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to open up my DB browser, and just give me a second to find this thing here. Server data. Okay. So you always want to check your data just to make sure that everything works the way that it's supposed to. Otherwise, you could end up working and doing a lot of stuff with just data that's not going to work. So there's everything. And if we check the users, it's the same. And also you can see that the faker data is coming in as text. So it's filling it all out for me. I didn't have to write all that down, which is great. Another thing that you should check out, this is DB browsers. It's very similar to SQLite, but you can come over here into execute SQL, and then you can just type in something like select and then all from, and then let's say students, and then just run that, and it'll basically do it for you. So you can write down your joins and everything in here. It's great for practicing SQL if you're going for a software engineer or a full stack interview or something for a job. I highly recommend that you get in there and try to work a little bit with SQL. They do end up adding those to the code challenges that they hand out. Okay, so we have our migrations, we have our seeds. So now what we can start looking into is filling out our routes. So that's gonna all be done through our API folder over here. So we're gonna need to add a few folders in here. So first off, let's close out everything else out, which as you can see, that pretty much closed out a bunch of stuff. The only thing that's still available is just our folders and these few files here. So we're still keeping our stuff small. All right, so for our API, we're gonna have two folders. We're gonna have our routers, and we're gonna have our helpers, which in some cases I've seen people move the helpers into the data folder instead, just to be closer to the actual data folder or data file. But whatever you're comfortable with, I prefer to put it over here so that the router doesn't have to go too far to get it, but whatever you're comfortable with. All right, so one thing that we're gonna need over here, we're gonna need a index.js for both the helper and the router. And that's to export everything. And then we're gonna need a post helper.js, and we're gonna need a student helper.js. And then we're gonna need a post router.js, and then student router.js. All right, so we're always gonna wanna start with the helper first, just because that's the base of your building block. So, and this is generally the workflow that I follow all the time. I build out the database and the server file and everything, and then move into the API last. And I think if you build in this structure, then you'll basically have a lot of your work already cut out for you, and it'll just be so much easier in the end. All right, so the first helper that we want to take a look at is our student helper. And it's not going to be anything fancy. We're only going to be building get routes for this. If you want to expand this later on, I'll give you a repo for this project, and you can just fork it or clone it or whatever you want to do. But we initially want to make sure that we bring in our database, which is our data config. And if you remember earlier when I went over that, all it was is just a it's just a file that where is it? There it is. So it's just a file that checks what environment you're in. In this case, the only environment that we're passing it is development, and then it sends it down to this knex file, which basically says, hey, I have a little area or a property called development. So this is where the database is. This is where migrations and seeds are. So that's all it's doing. Okay, so moving back over here, we're going to create our first get students helper. And the only job that it's going to do is just return the students. So really easy. You probably don't even want to create a helper for it, but I would always suggest that you do so, just because I feel like it would be a lot easier just to split everything up and then keep it over here in case you have to make a change. It's always easier to just go into a helper and write everything out there. All right, so then we have another function called get students, and then that's going to take in the ID of the student. And so what we're going to use that for is just to get an individual student. So it's going to be very close to what the other one looks like. So students, and then we're going to match the ID by saying where. And if you're confused about this over here, basically JavaScript lets you, or ES6 lets you destructure your objects. So writing this here is the same thing as saying ID if they both have the same name. If the key and the property have the same name, then we can or the key and the value, sorry. If the key and the value have the same name, then we can just cut that down to just this. All right, so now we're gonna export this. So module.exports, and we're gonna export both functions. So get students and get student. So what we can do now is go into our index.js, and this is gonna look really weird to some people, but we're going to basically say const students, or students, require, and then say student helper, and then we're gonna module.exports that. And if you're wondering why don't you just export it from the student file, you could do that as well. I just find that it's a lot cleaner and more and just easier for people to understand where everything's coming from if we just export it from a single file. But you can definitely still just export it directly from the file. That you can do that as well. Okay, so we're gonna basically pass in students all together, and we're spreading it there so that we can just, instead of using something like students dot, instead of using students dot get students and students dot get student, this way we're gonna be able to just basically kind of extract it from students. Okay, and we'll see what that looks like shortly. So now I want to create my student helper, or not student helper, our student router. So at this point, we get to do the fun stuff and just destructure that and say const get students, and then get student equals require dash helpers. There we go. Okay, so we're able to bring that in. We also have to bring in our router because we're going to be using that. So require router, or express dot router. So you can do it either this way, or you can just bring in express and then bring in router and do it that way, or you can just do it directly through here like this. All right. So next thing we're gonna do is get our first get request, and this one is gonna get all of our students for us. So nothing crazy. We're gonna do this one with async, and then I think we'll just do the next one with regular promises, just to have two examples. All right, so we got our rec and our res, and then we're gonna put in our try. Now I see that some people get confused as well for when it comes time to when do you put this this const in or outside of the try catch. And the way I can explain it is if you have something that you're grabbing from the URL, like a parameter or maybe something that's being sent through the body, such as like a username or password or something like that, then you would put that outside of the try catch because it doesn't really need to go in there. If anything, I think you'll get an error or something if you do try to do it there, because it doesn't have access to that. So catch that just the outside of the try catch and then pass it in. All right, so we're gonna use the get students method, and then we're gonna check if we have the students. And if we do, then we're going to return res.status 200.json, and then we're gonna pass in students. Okay. And then we're, of course, going to do our else statement in case we don't have any students, which usually is just means that the entire database was wiped. And then just say message. I totally messed that up. All right. Message, students all graduated. Okay, so, and then of course our catch. Now, one thing that I also see people not doing in the catch is actually passing that error. So when you're doing stuff with your error messages, when you're either catching an error or something like that, make sure that you are returning that. Reason being because if you don't, then you're basically missing out on some valuable error message that you could be getting. So it's okay to do something like message server done broke, and then passing in that error if you want. But just make sure that you're passing in that error. All right, so next one that we're gonna be writing is the one that will get you the individual user or the individual student. And so this one is gonna be very similar. If anything, I think it's actually shorter just because we're using promises instead. So this one's just gonna be get student, and you can totally check for the ID and stuff if you want. But in this case, I'm not gonna do that unless we have to debug or something. All right, so this one's gonna take student and then res.status 200 to let them know that everything is okay, and then we're gonna pass in student to send it to the front end. All right, so we're also gonna add our catch over here to be able to get any errors. So res.status 500.json, and then let's say message server done broke again, and then make sure that we're passing that error because that's going to tell us some information, and it's always going to be weird information, but in some cases you might actually need that information, or it might explain more than what everything else is telling you. So the more information you get, the better. All right, export. So now we're going to export our router. And then with that, we get to come into our index.js over here. And then we're going to say const student router equals require. And then bring in our student router. And then we're just going to module export it as a whole. So we don't have to do the spread operator or anything crazy like that for this one. We can just pass in student router as just one big object. Okay, so student router from there. And another thing, if you really wanted to, you could do something like this, where instead of even bringing that in there. You could do something like this here. So that's valid as well. But I don't really want to do that because I think it might confuse some people. So we're just going to leave it like this. Okay, so now what we can do is go back into our server file, right down over here, and we can import that. And we can just say const student router. And because of how we did it, we don't have to keep writing like over and over again, like where it's importing from. We'll eventually be able to bring in our post router from the same location. All right, so, and that's going to be in the API folder and then routers. All right, so now we can come down here and say server.use and then say student router. All right, so that should work. Fingers crossed, that should work. Let's say yarn server. Awesome. So I don't know about you, but I get nervous every time that I have to do that. And so I have no idea whether or not that's ever going to work. I just assume that it won't. All right, so now we're going to take a look at Postman. And I just ran the hello world over here. And so that's getting us our sanity test. Now we can move on to, let's say, students and see if that works. And cannot connect to server. So, oh, that's why. Missed the /. Okay, so there we go. So we're getting our three students over here. We're getting Carlos, Gabe, and Kasia. So everything's good there. Let's check if our ID is going through. There we go. So we type that in, we get our one student. So nothing crazy, very simple stuff. The next thing that we want to build now is just our post helper and then our post routes. And I'm going to kind of speed through this, but at the same time, I want to show you guys something pretty cool while we're doing this. So db.require, and then that's going to bring us back 2 files and into data, and then db config. So even though like this is going to be very similar to the other stuff, we do have to do a join for this one. So if you just want to see what a join is and have me explain what the syntax looks like and why it looks like that, because I think a lot of people think that you have to do multiple DB whatever things here. You really don't. So with a join, you would simply say, okay, from post, I want to do a join. And then I want to join it with students. And I want you, while you're joining things, I want you to look at post.student ID because we created a field like that in our schema earlier for our post model. And then I want you to match that up with students.id. So that's going to handle our post. So nothing too fancy, but because of this join, we don't have to call another database table just to grab that and then join it together. We can only we only have to call it once, and then over here it's going to look into the other table as well and then mix it together. So the next one that we're going to write is going to be const get post by user ID, and then this one's going to take in an ID. And then it's going to be a little bit crazier just because it's going to be a specific user. So one way that we could write this is we can skip the entire db.join and all this other stuff. And if you're really comfortable with SQL, then you can just do a SQL and then put some backticks, or sorry, you would do db. Actually, you would do a db.raw. There it is. So db.raw. I forgot the syntax for a second. And then put some backticks in here. And then you could effectively just write select all from posts, and then join students on posts dot student ID, where student ID equals students dot ID, and then say where posts dot student ID equals, and then we can add in our actual ID that we had from earlier. So this would actually work. And the way that we could even test that it works is we can bring back our SQLite Studio or DB browser, or whatever you want to call it. We can bring that back over here. And where is it? All right, so we still have this over here. We can pop that in there and then change this to like 1. And there you go. So we ran that, and then down here it tells you that it returned 9 items. So all of these should say ID 1 and then Carlos, and basically return the post that I did and all that. So it's returning everything to include the password. So that's one way that you could write the join, and you can literally just copy and paste that and drop that in there. There are a few issues with that, however, but I won't go into those. I'll let you explore that yourself and figure it out. For right now, I'm just going to keep this as, you know what, I'll just, in case people want to see this, I'll just comment that out and just do it the regular way and say return db posts dot join. Yeah, raw SQL is awesome. I prefer it just because you can use it in so many different things. So the problem with learning knex is that it doesn't translate to other database management systems, or query building systems, I should say. So you wouldn't write things in knex the way that you would write them in Mongo and MySQL and stuff. But if you're using regular SQL, like I think they all have a method where you can just use regular raw SQL. So it would still be you would still be able to use that. So post.student underscore ID, and then student dot ID dot where student students dot ID equals ID. So basically, if we're looking at these side by side, they do the exact same thing, I hope, because otherwise I just broke my code. But for the most part, they should do the exact same thing until I run it. And then that's when we'll figure out whether or not they do the same thing or if one just breaks. But here we go. So we're going to export that, get post, and then get post by user ID. So another thing is you always want to be as descriptive as possible with the names of your functions. So when you read this, get post by user ID, you already know that it's going to take in a user's ID. So I don't have to explain what this ID is. I don't have to give it a longer name. Just by looking at this, I already know that that's the ID it's going to take. So you could have also called that get single post, but then now you have to explicitly say that this is a user ID, or you need to write a comment or something like that, because somebody else might look at it and be like, well, what kind of ID does it take? Okay, so with that, we can just come back over here, and I don't need to bother remembering what the name of that of those two functions that I just wrote are, just because I can just do something like, let's say post, and then post helper. So I think that should be all right. Yeah, well, I think I just named it post helper. Yeah, so that would be all messed up. Okay, so then we can export our post right here, and then make our way to our post router. So yeah, it does seem like more stuff to write, to have to like create something in a different file and bring it in as a helper and all that. And in a small project, you might be right, but once you start mixing with other people and everybody has to write routes and stuff, if you have like one person writing like helpers and another person writing routes somewhere else, like splitting up your code can make it so much easier. Okay, so we're going to require that helpers index .js. So when you're using index.js, you don't need to specify index.js over here. And then we're also going to bring in router. So here's that cool line that we did before where we just did it all together in one line. And then say router. Okay, and then do our first get. And say async rec res. And then try. And I'll show you in a second what I meant when I said that some of your variables you have to put outside of the try catch. Posts, was it plural? Yep, okay, so I wrote that right. Okay, so and then we're gonna check if the post exists, and then return res.status 200.json, and then we're gonna pass in those posts. So keep in mind that as I'm writing these, because of the way that I wrote this, I don't have to say post.getPost or users.getPost or any of that other stuff. So that's part of the exporting that I did. Because of the spread operator that I used over here, because of the spread operator that I did over here, it's pretty much bringing them all in together. So I'm exporting both of these, and then in here, I'm importing them as one big object, and then I'm spreading them out over here. So it's like I'm exporting them all individually. And because of that, when we go into our router, we don't have to say like post.getPost, which I think just looks a lot cleaner. All right, so then we do our else, return res.status 400.json message post post does not exist. I think I spelled that right. I hope so. All right, so catch, and then we're gonna pass in our error, and if you want, you can also console log the error if that helps you debug your stuff better. But obviously, you have to do it before the return. Otherwise, it's never gonna make it. So there we go. So we have our first route over here. I want to finish building out our second route, which is going to get our post by user ID before we actually test this out. I don't always recommend doing that. I usually recommend building out one route at a time and testing everything one thing at a time as much as possible. It makes it a lot easier to debug problems, but for the interest of time, I'm just going to write these out. So in this one here, because we're receiving a parameter from our front end. In this case, it's going to be my Insomnia or your Postman or whatever you're using. That we're putting our variable for our ID outside of the try catch. If we were to put it inside, it would not have access to it, and so it would give us an error. And so we're going to use that get post by user ID, and then we're going to pass in that ID that we just got from up there. All right, so we're also going to check if post, then we want to return res.status 200.json post. Else something's broken, so return res.status. Well, it's not broken, it's just that it doesn't exist. So 400.json, and then message that post does not exist. All right, and then we want to do our catch in case there's an error, because an error isn't necessarily the same thing as saying that it doesn't exist. An error is more so like the code broke because what you passed was so invalid that the server just couldn't take it. Okay, so, and then we're passing our error. And then we come down here and we export this. So module.exports equals router. Okay, so now we get to do all the fun stuff again that we did earlier, where we just get to import it into our index. And so it's a very circular flow. You start off over here in the helpers, and then you build out your helper, bring it into index, and then come into your router, use it, and then export the router into index, and then it just goes into your server file. So very circular flow, and that's pretty much it takes a little bit to get used to creating anything with that kind of workflow, I think, but in the end, the result is you get much more cleaner and modular code, and it basically makes it a lot easier to work in. So it's kind of like if you're building something with Redux, where there's a bit of boilerplating to Redux and just overall getting used to it, but at the end you get much more modular code that teams can work in. So with that said, if I were to close everything, this is still what our root directory looks like. So just currently just 3 files and then these 2 files here. And then if I were to open this, still not a lot of files because everything is in its own little location. All right, so going back over here, we exported our post router, and now we want to be able to bring that back into our server.js so that we can use it. So we can just come over here and say post router, and then copy this because I'm lazy and just say post, and then say post router. There we go. So I should be able to bring this up here, and hopefully if I didn't break anything, say post and then get the post. So there we go. So these are all the posts over here. So with IDs 1 all the way to 3. And then now I want to be able to get an individual one. So here we go. So now I'm getting all of the ones with the student ID of 1. So just to be sure that it works, we can put a 2 in there. And then now we're getting all the stuff that Gabe posted, and then 3, and we're gonna get all the stuff that Kasia posted. So really cool. All right, so let's get this out of the way. So now what I want to do is I want to start working on authentication. So first thing that we can do is create a restricted function. We're gonna be using sessions and all that for this, but this is pretty much the more exciting part of everything. So we're gonna go into our config file, which if you remember, this is where all of our middleware is. I wanna keep this separated from the base middleware. So you can create another file and you can call this whatever you want. You can call it custom middleware if you wanna put more than one middleware or something in there. I'm just gonna call it restricted. And I'm just gonna put one middleware function in here. So. And then we're just going to write function restricted, and then pass in rec, res, and then next. And then the first thing that we're going to check is if the user is logged in. And so we're going to check rec.session, which is going to be passed in later on. And then rec.session user ID. So all of this is going to be stored in memory with session because session deals with memcache, which is just a memory storage. And then else res.status and then 401.json. And you don't ever really want to tell anybody too much information, at least not a user. Just give them like invalid credentials or something like that. You don't want to tell them why they failed, whether or not it's a password issue or something like that, because if it's a hacker, then you're basically helping them make their job a lot easier. And then we're just going to export this restricted function. Okay. So we exported that. Now, one thing that we can do is we can't really test it yet because we haven't built out our actual auth, which can be an issue. So what I want to do now is go into our middleware, and then I want to bring in the stuff that I'm going to need in order to create that session storage. So we're going to do a const and then say session equals require, and then bring in express session. Cool. Because I didn't know how to spell it apparently. So this thing fixed it for me. And then we're going to create a session store. And then that's going to be require connect session connects, which we installed earlier. And then we're going to pass it in session. So if you're wondering how this right here works, like how you could build something like that, really all this is just, let's just call it a function called connect session store. And then that's a function right here. And then return a function here. So essentially that's all it is. If you were to call this right now, let's say this is A, and then this takes in a parameter B, and then you want to console.log A and B. Let me give this a different name. So store, I want to see if I can actually run this with Polka. Can I do it? Okay. So let's say console.log and then say store A. Actually, should be 1 and then 2. Polka run that. There you go. So 1 and 2. So if you're wondering how this thing is built like that, it's basically something that returns an object and then it takes in a parameter. So the first parameter is going to be this connect session or connect session connects. And then the second parameter is the session that's being passed in up here. So that's how we can build out something like that. The reason why this is getting undefined is because I'm not returning it over here. So if I were to, let's say, return, it's not going to do it. But anyway, you get the point. So, all right, so that's how that works. Okay, so now we need to build out our session configuration. So const session config, and each session config, the first part of it is going to look very similar to JWT. Once you get into it, it always has to take in a secret, and that's going to be a .env that we're going to create. But for the sake of this, actually, I'll show you how to use a .env since we just created it. So we got a .env, and then inside of our .env, we want to basically create something that will handle our secret. So we can just say secret or session secret, and then say this is my secret, and then say something like session name. This is my session name. There we go. And then we can go into middleware and just pass in the process.env session secret, and then we can pass in the name process.env session name. Does somebody have a question? I saw somebody hop on, just making sure.
Oh, I just came in. Sorry.
Oh, okay. That's cool, man. Welcome aboard. All right,
Thank
so next thing we're going to do is set up our cookie so that it can store data for us. And then we're going to be passing in the secure option. For this, we're going to set it to false just because we're going to be in development. So basically, because we're not using HTTPS, We're just using HTTP for localhost. We can set that to false. So let's say HTTP, let's say S in production, change to true. So if you're going to be using that in production, you're going to want to change that to true because you'll be using HTTPS. And then we're going to set our max age, which you can pretty much put whatever you want, but we're just going to set it for about 5 minutes. Okay. All right, so moving on. So HTTP only basically means that you can't access it through JavaScript and all that. You can only access it through HTTP methods. And then resave. So this, you can set it to true if you want to store longer data. If you want persistent data that'll live longer than just a login. If you're just handling it for login and not trying to save a bunch of data into your cookies and all that, then you can just leave this as false, and then it'll be perfect for just using it for authentication. Uninitialized equals false. All right, so now we're going to create our store. So we have our knex session store. And I no longer need Quokka. That's actually going to start bothering me after a while. Let's say Quokka stop, please. I don't know if I just stopped it or I just started all over again. All right, we're just going to drop this down and just ignore Quokka. Okay, so building out our store. So we have to create our mem cache with this store. So our memory cache. That's what the store does. So for a table name, we're just going to call it sessions. And then SID file name. That's just going to be SID by default. I think it goes into just SID by default, if I'm not mistaken. And then basically what this does is it creates the database tables and stuff for you in case you need them. We're not really going to need them, but it's good to have this set up anyway. All right, so with that, we also have to bring in our database so that it knows that we have one. So we're going to say const db equals require data, and then db config. There we go. So now it knows what db is. And I'm totally going to completely ignore Quokka because it doesn't work very well with imported and exported files. It only works well with local files. So, and I just don't know how to turn it off on this Mac right now. All right, so I don't think we need a note for that. And then create table. So basically what this will do is if you don't have a table created for all of this stuff, then the library will pretty much create one for you. And then clear interval, which I think I spelled that right. I could have spelled it wrong. I think it's something like that. Let's say 1,000. So after, let's see, 1,060 and then 60. So we want to clear that out. Okay, so we're done with our configuration there, and then we have to make sure that we add it down here to our exports over here. And so we're going to say server.use and then pass in session and then our session config up here that we just created. So session config. So we're passing that out. So now we have access to all of that cool stuff through our server.js middleware config over here. We didn't have to pile up too much stuff in here, but because of that, we can start building out cool things like our auth routes and helpers and stuff. So let's create another helper over here, and we're just going to call it auth helper.js. And then this one is going to take our db require data db config, and then we're going to bring in bcrypt. And then we're going to set up first our registration. And that's going to take in our creds. So keep in mind, this is just a helper. So our creds is going to come in from our actual HTTP request that we're going to be passing this helper to. So it's not going to be available right now. But we're going to take in our creds.password. And then we're going to check if we got that password, and we're going to hash it using bcrypt. So bcrypt.hashsync, and then we're going to grab in that password. So creds, password, and then you can pretty much hash it as many times as you want. I'm just going to do 10. But the longer that you, the higher number that you use to hash it, the longer it's going to take to hash, which doesn't really matter too much. Because it'll just be more security anyway. All right, so DB, and in the terms of computer science, as far as the big O notation and how long it's going to take to process, nobody really cares about that for this. Oh, did I misspell something? There we go, hash. All right, thank you, Kasia. You caught my spelling error that probably would have taken me like 20 minutes to figure out later on. All right, so we're going to basically return our student table, and then we're going to insert our creds. So that's going to be our username, password, whatever we decide to pass from Postman or Insomnia. All right, so else, and then you can handle this however you want. I'll just throw in a new error or something. No password provided. Since we're only really checking for password, if you want to check for user ID as well, or a username or something like that, you can do that and then just pass in a different error message. And then we're going to create our login as well. And we're going to say const login equals, and then say creds. And in this one, we're going to check in if both the username and password has been passed in. So we're going to say creds dot username and creds dot password. Then we're going to return db students dot where username equals creds dot username, and then we're going to return first. Else, we're going to just throw a new error like we did up top. And then credentials, I think I spelled it like that, yep, do not match. The one thing I do love about writing strings in JavaScript is that they don't have a spell check, so I feel like I always got it right until something tells me that it's an error. All right, so module.exports, we can do the same thing that we did before. We can export register and login. Oh, should be registration. Let's just say register. I think that's shorter. Okay. All right, so we can export those out there. And then just realize, okay, let's see, auth helper, where is my file? Okay. So I put this in the wrong place. Just realized that. So this needs to go into my helper. There we go. All right. So that needs to go into my helper file, not the config. And then we can just pass that in there. So we can just say const auth equals require auth helper, and then we can just pass in auth the same way that we passed everything else. And then we can start creating our auth route as well. So we can just go up in here, and it's the same process as everything else that we have followed so far. We just create a auth router.js. And I'm still looking into the chat. Doesn't look like we got anything new, so that's all right. Okay, so we're going to be bringing in login, register, and then say require helpers. So we're still reaching into that index file. We're also going to need bcrypt. All right, and then we're going to need that router. So router equals require, and then we're going to bring in express, and then attach router to it. All right, so the first thing that we're going to want to do in order to test everything out is create our register route. So we've got post, and then register. And that's going to be res, and then drop it down here. So we're going to capture the credentials here, rec.body. And remember that when we wrote our previous register function, it takes in creds. So we have to pass in creds when we use it. So we'll say register and then say creds. And then over here, we're just going to use promises. I'm not going to get too fancy because this isn't going to be that big as it is. And then it's going to return an ID, res.status 201.json. And then we're just going to pass that in. A lot of times, if you have bugs in this area where it doesn't seem like something is happening, I would put a bunch of layers of console logs in between the promise and everything else, just to make sure that what you're passing in is even making it through. So I find a lot of people tend to get stuck there. Okay, so then we just put in our catch. So because of our helper, this file is pretty short, or this function, I should say, this HTTP request is pretty short. So status 400.json error. And then we'll get to do our login. So login, and then res. And then for this one, we'll capture the creds again, just like we did in the last one. What's going on? Did I misspell const or something? Oh, there we go. That's what I did wrong. I don't know how to write functions. So we're going to be using the login that we're bringing in up here. And then we're also going to pass that the creds. And then we're going to use our promise over here to say then. And we're going to pass that along. And we get to do the very boilerplatey hash compare. But essentially what this portion is doing is it's comparing the regular version of the password that you're sending in. So it's comparing that with the version that it has stored. So it basically has to hash your password to check that it would equate to what it currently has in the store or in your database. All right, so, and then we're going to do rec.session.user_ID. So session has its own storage, and what we're basically doing is going into that storage and establishing that the user ID is the same as the user.id, which we're getting back from over here. And then we are going to do a res.status 200.json message, and then just say welcome aboard. Else res.status 401, or 410 apparently, 401.json message invalid creds. So we're not telling them what's invalid, we're just telling them that they didn't match what we have on file. That way, if it's a hacker, we won't make life easier on them. So res.status 500.json, and then we're gonna pass in our error. Okay, so we have our register and our login. The one thing that I do want to also add, just to cheat over here, is the log out. So we're gonna add the logout function over here. So, and that one, it doesn't really need a helper. If you want to try to build one, you can go for it, but I don't think there's any need for it because Session actually has a built-in method called destroy that'll do all of the work for us. So rec res, and this, make sure I add that because I broke it. All right, so we're gonna say if rec.session is available. So if we have a session storage currently doing session storagey things, then we want to destroy it. And if there's an error, we want to send that error. So res.send, and then say message. You can never leave because we broke something. So we're also going to send that error there. And then let's see. So there is no error. So if rec.something.error. Okay. And then add my else statement here. Else res.send. You have logged out, which I think I actually put it in the wrong place. I'm pretty sure I just did. All right, so let's just copy that out of there. Okay, so let's see. So we have to add our error here. So if error, and then we can add our else here. There we go. Cool. So now we can export this router. Exports equals router. And then we can just say off router, and once again off router. And then we can add that to our server file over here. All right, so server.use, and then one more thing that I want to do just to make sure that we're properly authenticated is I want to be able to go into our one of our other routes and basically just restrict them so that we know that that we are authorized to be there. And so I can go into my student routes and I want to bring in restricted equals require, and that should be in our middleware file that we created earlier, which is in config and then restricted, because we have that in a file by itself. And all we have to do really is just add it into this one here. So we want everybody to have access to all of the student lists, but for an individual student, we're just going to restricted. And so we just drop that in there and then kind of hope that it works. All right, so restricted over here. All right. Okay, so we got our server thing here. So now I'm going to bring back this here. First, I'm going to stop this because we wrote a lot of things and I want to make sure that everything works right. All right, cool. So nothing broke yet. And I say yet. So here's our post for our get route. So we're going to check the students. So students. All right, so that's still returning all of the students. But what if I want to get the first student? That should not allow me to do it. And so invalid credentials. So that means that at least part of our function works, our restriction function works. So now what if I want to, let's say, register, let's register a user. So let's say register, actually it should be auth register. And then we're gonna be using JSON. All right, so let's say it takes in a username. And then we're just gonna call this one Rod. Password. Some password. All right, so we should be able to send this unless I wrote something wrong. And all right, cool. So we get our ID back. And then now we should also be able to use him to log in. And we broke something. What did I break? So that's part of the fun things. All right, so let's figure out where did I break something at. So the first thing that I'm going to check, this is a fun debugging moment, but the first thing that I'm going to check is I always like to start in my auth route, and most likely it's or in my my helper, I should say, and usually it's just a spelling error or something somewhere. So we're looking into our login and then just kind of going down the line to make sure that everything matches. So let's see, we have creds.username and creds.password, so that looks right. And then we have db and then students.where the username equals creds.username and then return first. Okay, so that looks right. Let's see, creds.username. All right, so that looks right to me. If anybody sees anything that I broke there, by all means. Okay, so then we can go into auth router and see if I wrote everything right there. And then check out our login function over here. So we're taking in creds equals rec.body. And then login, we're taking in cred. And then passing in user. And then checking if user user exists, and if bcrypt.comparesync creds.password user.password rec.session user ID is now going to equal the user.id. And then
Carlos, I think it's the line 20 where you have creds.password. There's a typo in the password.
yeah, there it is. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I would have never found that. I really appreciate that.
No problem.
All right, so let's try that again. All right, so let's try that again. Hopefully we can get Rod through this. There we go. Cool. So a little typo. They're going to be the end of us. All right, so with that login, we should have also gotten something else. So we should have gotten a cookie with that. So here's our cookie. And then over here, you can see that it's named after what I put into that process.env earlier. So over here, we have, this is my session name, which is probably best to just keep the name short. And then that's getting pushed into this config over here. So where we put our secret and our name. So that's where that's coming from. So what we're gonna want to do is grab that, and we want to go back and check and see if we can get that student again. We're super nosy and we want to get that student. So if I come over here and I click, first I need to go into Git, I click that, I'm still gonna get that something is wrong. Let's see, students should be S. So I'm still gonna get, well, I'm gonna get this now because I'm authenticated. There we go. So we have all of our users there, and then we're even able to check the new user that we registered, and we can see that Rod has a password that is extremely long and ultra hashed. And so he's also added. And that's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions or anything that you want me to explain that I didn't go over too well? All right, so some people are typing. And let me stop sharing because I want you to be a part of this party. How does the hash algorithm work? Oh, Lord. So depends on if you're using something like a hash table, in which you'll actually learn in CS. But the way that it initially works is you have a separate function. If we're talking about something like a hash table, you have a separate function. And the way you can picture it is if you have like an index number or index value, you would create a kind of messed up version of something, and then you would create the original version. So you have them both sitting over here. And then you create a kind of like a singular point to that index. So they both share that same location in that index table. And you kind of use that as a reference to the original with the hashed thing. However, I don't think that's how hashes actually work. Hash algorithms work. So don't ask me that question. Next. Thank you, Cassia. Cassia says that it was great. Keep in mind that this project took me a long while to build from beginning to end. And so it's not expected that you guys build every single project that you build that way. Just because it can take a long time just to be able to get through all of that and get all of that like down to a science where you can practice it and apply it so quickly. But I do highly recommend that you look into at least a similar fashion of building when you start getting into build weeks and labs and you have other teams of people that are going to be contributing to the same code base as yourself. Once you get into labs, everybody's going to be expected to do front end and back end code. So you won't have a particular role. You might have some people who are more comfortable in certain areas, but part of the requirements is that everybody's got to have a certain amount of pull requests in the front end and certain amount of pull requests in the back end. So with that, you don't want to have to wait until somebody's done and they've done a pull request and their PM has merged it and all of that other stuff just to be able to get your hands in there and get the stuff done that you need done. So Dustin says, what happens to the old password when we go into production and I realize my hash needs more salt? So, you can still change your password. Like your database does have access to that old password now. It depends on the type of database that you use. However, if you're using something like, let's say you're using SQLite still, then SQLite, everything is saved into a file. Now, if you're using something like Postgres or even a NoSQL like Mongo, then there are different methods, but essentially you would just use a put request in order to change what you're going to be putting in there to include your password. So if we added a new function that adds more hash or more salt, then you would just do a put request and it would take it through that system again. Can I get an emoji, a thumbs up or something? You made me answer that long question. He's probably been thinking this whole time what to ask me just to put me on the spot. All right, so it looks like we have a few more minutes till my time. I'm in the East Coast, so it's almost 6. I don't even know when we're supposed to actually stop, like after hours. But does anybody have any questions? All right, so I did get a bunch of emojis, so I appreciate that. Okay, and I will be dropping a GitHub repo to a similar project that has a lot of this stuff for you guys so that you can take a look at it. And like I said, feel free to clone it or fork it or whatever and do whatever you want with it. And it has all of this stuff in it. Okay, so with that, thank you very much for coming to After Hours. I did create a thread up here. I saw some people have been putting their names and stuff in there. I think some people are missing for the attendance, however, so I'm going to share it again. And if you haven't posted in there, just do me a favor and just like say that you were here there. All right, that's it. See you guys next time.